So we're now moving on to our second main event. On March 11th, 2020, I was preparing for a reception and reading for our guest, who's here tonight, when word came down from on top that the campus was closing, students were going home, and all public events were canceled. Now, 2 years and 26 days later, Professor Chang has returned. And as I told her yesterday, I feel an abundant sense of closure from this event. It was a piece of unfinished business longed for that now we're going to get to have. Sadly for me, the elegant, eloquent introduction I had crafted for her in March 2020 has gone missing. And I've searched. Happily for us all, in the intervening 2 years, a wonder has occurred, and Professor Chang's new novel, The Family Chao, was published by Norton this February. The novel is available for purchase in the lobby, courtesy of Main Street Books, along with, I believe, some other of Professor Chang's works after the reading. So please stop by on your way out. It's wonderful. I stayed up way too late. I try not to read too late at night because I get too excited, and I broke my own rule because I love this book so much. Bear in mind, lost my eloquent, elegant introduction, take my word for it, and I'm going to share a few thoughts that I have gathered together about our guest. Thought 1, Professor Chang makes a difference. Oprah Daily published an article in January of this year celebrating 8 remarkable women, including Isabel Allende and Margaret Atwood and Lan Samantha Chang. In their words, the 8 authors we celebrate here are not simply writing books, which itself would be a remarkable enough accomplishment. These astonishing women are using their words and their platforms, their power, to open our eyes, awaken our senses, and deepen our understanding of each other and the society we live in. Her college's newspaper, end quote, her college's newspaper, the Iowa Daily, had an interview with Professor Chang after this honor was announced, and they explained her impact to the famed Iowa Writers' Workshop, which she directs in this interview. When she took the position, she was the first woman and the first Asian American to do so. She told her interviewer that she felt supported in, quote, taking the program in a direction that would include writers from many backgrounds to make it possible for their stories to be told. Access like that brings access to publishing and to people celebrating in your art with you. Tonight we have among us a scholar, translator, professor, poet, beloved Davidson faculty member, Jack Jung, who is a graduate of that very program under Sam's direction. So you can see actually the impact right here. Point 2. She illuminates the narratives closest to home. Our primary experiences with belonging, with rejection, with love, and with loss occur in and through family very often. Among other unsettling facts I discovered today, murder victims meet their demise at the hands of a family member nearly a quarter of the time. Comforting fact for you. And yet, the most painful losses of the last 2 years for many of us were the loss of time with distant loved ones, if not the loss of loved ones, right? So family goes always, and in those profound ways. Professor Chang's stories and novels bring readers into particular specific families who are challenged by world events, geographic dislocations, cultural differences, sibling rivalries, and the inevitable ways parents wish for their children, sometimes push upon their children what they may not have or what they long for. We are born into the oldest story in this way, and I can't think of a writer whose families have moved me as much as yours have moved me recently. 3, she's a master stylist and narrativist. As noted in the Guardian review for this novel, this is a great quote, Chang's prose moves with the unfussy ease of a shark through water. For the longest time, you are just enjoying your swim, soaking up the story. Only midway through the book does it occur to you that a master hunter is at work, a writer cutting through the darker depths of what it means to be treated as an outsider in America, end quote. Tonight, we're going to get to be in that water. Professor Chang is the author of 2 previous novels, All Is Forgotten, Nothing Is Lost, and Inheritance, and a story collection, Hunger. Her short stories have appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Ploughshares, and the Best American Short Stories, among others. She's received major fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and most recently the American Academy in Berlin, among many honors. As I've mentioned, Professor Chang is the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and she lives with her family in Iowa City, Iowa. Please join me in welcoming back to Davidson, 2 years and 26 days later, Lan Samantha Chang.
Hello, everyone. It's really great to be back at Davidson. I hope that I see Davidson again at some point in my future life because I've had such a lovely time here and I've had major important events in my life happen here, like that afternoon sitting there watching the stock market crash, the NBA cancel itself, the world coming to an end. I'll always think of this place in that way, but in a good way. But I do feel it's coming back that there's something familiar and important about this place to me, so I hope I come back again. As they say, once is a blip, twice is a trend. Okay. I'd like to read from my new book, and I decided not to start at the beginning. I'm going to start in the middle, but I'll send you up to speed. Basically, it's a Chinese-American restaurant succession novel that is set in the Midwest. There is a man named Liu Chao, who's a tyrannical, difficult parent with a big dream of making a lot of money at his restaurant. And there are 3 sons, Dago, who's the oldest, Ming, who's the middle, and James, who's the youngest. And they're very different, the way that people can be different when they're raised by, the same set of parents, but at different points in their lives. James is one of the major characters in the novel, and I'm going to read a part from his point of view that takes place almost exactly halfway through. So in the first half, you meet the 3 brothers and their dad. Major conflicts ensue. There's a major party. There's a couple of big food feasts, and the father is discovered frozen in the restaurant freezer room. I'm just going to give that plot point away because I think it's written in the jacket. So James is completely baffled by all of this. Also, during the first half of the book, he also loses his mother in between the first and second half. So I'm going to describe, I guess I'll just start in. There's a diner across the neighborhood. It's called the Other Restaurant because it's owned by the Caucasian restaurant family in the neighborhood, and they're kind of mortal enemies. Okay. 3 months later. It is now late March. Morning sun slants through the plate glass windows of Scare's Diner, reaching the corner where James Chao sits reading with a half-finished plate of scrambled eggs and toast. He glances out from his hoodie. It's the same university hoodie he wore at the train station in the first chapter of this book, but he is no longer a student. He hasn't been on campus since January, when Winnie suffered her second fatal stroke. At that point, he applied for a leave of absence and moved his things out of the dormitory back to Haven, Wisconsin. His hair is shaggy, and more length has come into his hands, but the most noticeable change is in the way he looks out from the hoodie. It's not the expression of a college student. There's another change. The red-haired server at the diner is watching him. From behind the register, she lets her gaze slide over to his corner of the room. She makes eye contact when she takes his order and comes back to say they're out of strawberry jam packets, but she found one more in the back. James notices her, too, sees the way the small silver cross rests on her freckled chest and moves as she breathes. He knows what her attention is about. In the last few months, he's experienced a transfiguration. A current has run through his body, waking him up. Still, he can't quite understand what she sees in him. In truth, he exists in a liminal space, bridging his old self to a future self he can't yet grasp. He's rereading the website article, The Curious Case of the Brothers Karamojong. It is ostensibly an analysis of the impending trial of William Dago Chao, now known as Dog Eater, who has been indicted for committing a, quote, restaurant murder set in an insular Midwestern Chinese-American community in a, quote, ethnic enclave where an American girl, a blonde bombshell, this is Brenda, who's a brunette, who changed her hair color senior year of high school, drove the father and son into a frenzy, compelling the suspect to work out obsessively, then to embark upon a desperate spending spree, leading to a bacchanalian Christmas bash, culminating in the consumption of the family dog, whose fate has become an anti-immigration flashpoint. A party followed by the suspicious death of the father, owner of the restaurant. They keep to themselves, said Jane Yoder, a neighbor James has never met. They have their restaurant and their own friends. A member of Dago's high school class is quoted as saying, he was obsessed with her. She was everything, blue-eyed and sexy on the homecoming court. James takes a few more bites of scrambled eggs, studying the photos. First, Dago's mugshot, widely circulated since the story was picked up by the supermarket tabloids. Quote, suspect William Dago, Dog Eater Chao. The image is Dago, and not Dago, darker than he really is, with fierce, hooded eyes. His gaze challenges James, yet beseeches him, and there's an almost disturbing air of repose in the curve of his full mouth. The website has gotten hold of more images of Dago, his high school and college yearbook photos, also printed in a manner that make him seem more dark-skinned than he is, and one snapshot from New York City of anonymous origin, showing the 25-year-old Dago leaning over his base, his bow low at the frog, his shoulders bunched under his shirt. Brenda's high school yearbook photo could have been dropped in directly from a 1950s pinup poster. Her blue eyes gleam at James. A wave of ash blonde hair curves against her cheek. She is so fresh and sultry that there could be no question she, quote, drove the immigrant father and his son into a frenzy. In Ming's photo, he appears more light-skinned than he really is. But the contrast with Dago is just as obvious in his erect posture, his jacket and tie, his aura of conventionality and exactitude. Quote, the middle brother whose ignorance of the conflict and whose absence from the crime scene clearly exonerates him from the murder. Ming Chao has provided the financial support to release Dago, Dog Eater Chao, on $1 million bail. Under James's photo, the article has reprinted the one quote James gave to a reporter before Ming texted him to shut up. My brother and father had their disagreements, but Dago would never commit murder. My brother is innocent. For some reason, Ming and Catherine don't want James to release any more statements to the press, not even in support of Dago. They've made James promise not to talk, even though Jerry Stern, Dago's lawyer, issued no such edict. In Elf, the family dog's close-up, he's less than a year old, almost unrecognizably puppyish. He gazes directly at James, head cocked slightly, bat ears unfolded in typical unceasing alertness. His small black nose is shaped like a heart. The fur on his jowls shimmers, and the blaze on his chest is bright white and fluffy. The image is cropped so that his hindquarters are only partially visible, and a woman's arm, Winnie's, can just be seen. His mother and Elf are gone now. James puts down his fork and shields his eyes with his hands. It's a few minutes before he can refocus on his screen. There are 294 comments. James scrolls down, then clicks. Comment from Sherry, California, 42 minutes ago. As a dog lover, I cannot forgive William Chao for callously cooking and serving his father's pet. This is indefensible behavior. I noticed the story of Elf's disappearance, and the mysterious meat dish, which was earlier reported, has been hushed up. PETA, P-E-T-A, has this under investigation, and the truth will out. Animal abuse is criminal and immoral. Justice for Elf. Jean Hu from Manhattan 38 minutes ago. The dog dinner is the juniper tree adult diaper revenge drive detail of this story making it go viral. Without Elf, no one would care. You'd have just another private tragedy of an oppressed immigrant family. Feng Hua from Haven 36 minutes ago. As a person who has known the Chao family for many years, I deride the spread of this rumor as false and malicious, not to mention racist gossip. The entire Chao family was devoted to Elf and was brokenhearted when he disappeared. The dog meat story began as a joke. This incident has been blown up and circulated by anti-Asian scandal mongers. Charlotte Wisniak from Oshkosh 32 minutes ago. Stop the abuse of helpless animals. Eugene from Iowa City 30 minutes ago. Please see the attached link to a consortium of dog lovers and concerned citizens from many countries who have been able to rescue Asian restaurant dogs and bring them to the US for adoption. Joe M. from Louisville 8 minutes ago. I lived in Xi'an for 2 years. It's where I met my wife. I was able to taste dog meat several times. It's good. A lot like mutton, but with this special savory flavor. I happen to know that the Chinese prize black dogs for their flavor over any other color. Jonathan N. from Lafayette 46 minutes ago. As a Chinese American, I find this entire case an embarrassment to my community. Keiko, Milwaukee 43 minutes ago. Your comment is an example of the self-hatred that has led to stereotypes such as model minority. Why must we Asians be superior to other groups? G.S. Mung, Flushing 1 hour ago. This story is blowing up because of the racism of white American community. Look to your own family's people and don't throw stones. Linda H., Washington, D.C., 5 minutes ago. Agreed. In the newspapers, there are articles about a tyrannical world leader driving immigrants away from the borders of a country that was once a haven for refugees, police officers choking our own citizens in cold blood, immoral judges disallowing marriages of lifelong lovers, deranged shooters gunning down scores of well-wishers at a rock music benefit, children going hungry in acutely troubled countries whose economies are stumbling from corruption, hurricanes, floods, tsunamis, whales beaching and foundering on the shores, runaway fires streaking down clogged arteries of desperately escaping vehicles. Amid this turmoil and grief, why Leo Chao? Why did the death of Leo Chao become news? It couldn't just be the rumor of a dog meat restaurant. Perhaps it debunks the myth of immigrant success and tells the story from behind the high walls of family and community, that behind a family business, a successful father and a set of handsome sons prowls, clawed and fanged, a mythical monstrousness of tyranny, hatred, and murderous intent? Or perhaps it's all a desperate need for readers to displace their hatreds, their traumas, the tyrannies under which they suffer, onto a story of tyranny and revenge, refreshing and different enough to allow them to believe it is not theirs. Sylvia Hahn, Atlanta 28 minutes ago. Brenda Wazacek is a trashy gold digger bent upon corrupting the lives of innocent Chinese men, and she has been a poor influence on the 3 sons, not to mention the father. 5 replies. Saskia, 27 minutes ago. Dago, I'll make you forget all about Brenda. Jana, 26 minutes ago. Yes, I heart Dago. Franny, 25 minutes ago. James is the one for me. What a sweetie, heart, heart, heart. Nunu, 23 minutes ago. Ming Chao is the hottest, with a $sign. Ed Wong, 19 minutes ago. At last, I've discovered the secret of how to attract women as an Asian male. Get indicted for patricide. The diner door opens and shuts. James squints through the sunlight at the newcomer who approaches his corner wearing a jacket and a Mao cap. Scare's Diner is where no reporters, friends, or even family would go to find James, but beneath the red star and khaki brim, familiar, curious dark eyes shine through the dirty wire-rimmed glasses. It's Fong, his friend. Fong removes his cap, comes directly to the booth, and stands there observing him. James shuts his computer. I thought I might find you here, Fang says. You ready to go to the spiritual house? No. James smooths his hair with his fingers. Under his hoodie, he's wearing a white dress shirt. In an hour, the community will gather for a memorial to mark the final day of the 7th week after Winnie's death. Let's walk there together, Fang says. I have something to discuss with you. Leaving the restaurant, they turned down the adjacent alley in order to keep their journey private. Since the story in USA Today, they've had to make an effort to avoid strangers, literally yellow journalists, Fang says, camping out at the Holiday Inn, lurking near the restaurant, or attaching themselves to any Asian passerby to ask if they know the Chao family or anything about them. For a few minutes, they don't speak. In the freedom of an alley, James relaxes in silent companionship, letting his mind wander. During these last months, with the tumult of shock and change, time has shifted. He half expects to see his father, alive once more, striding toward them in the alley, a little rumpled, squinting in the morning sun. Fang pulls out his cap and puts it back on. Why did you go to that awful diner? Privacy, I guess. I'm surprised you're not driven out by the bad vibes, Fang says. But listen, I need to talk to you. They reach an intersection with a medium-sized street, and James crosses quickly, head down, ducking back into the alley. Fang trots after him. Listen, James, do you remember what Guling Jucher told your dad? You know I don't understand anything she says, but Dago told me I remember. Guling Jucher told him he was in danger of a bad death. What does that mean? A bad death doesn't stop with the death. It means something in his death is going to be a part of your life. It's going to play out and become your story. Fang's gaze is dark. Although he and Alice appear hobbled by eccentricity, they're also emboldened by it. Their mother is an ordinary person, but somewhere within her, or more likely within their lost father, there must have been a great capacity for strangeness. Fang doesn't care what people think. He doesn't lose track of anything he sees, and he won't fail to speak up. Ming says Fang is un-American. He has no ability to adapt, forget. Isn't that what you do in America? Adapt? Forget? Now Fang says, do you remember that racist children's book, the book about the Chinese brothers? The words echo in James's mind, but only faintly. Once upon a time, Fang intones, sing-songing, there were 5 Chinese brothers, and they all looked exactly alike. Now James remembers the image on the cover, 5 pigtailed, slit-eyed figures lined up in a row. He'd rather forget it. But he says, each of the brothers had a superpower. Each of the brothers was a freak. The first could swallow the sea. The second had an iron neck. The third could stretch his legs like rubber bands. And the fourth brother could survive fire. And the 5th could hold his breath for an immeasurable amount of time. Not superpowers exactly, but distortions. A Western catalog of dehumanization. The brothers are interchangeable, yet freaks. And do you remember to what ends the freakish powers were deployed? Do you remember, James? No. James wants and needs to be left alone. But the only way to end a conversation with Fang is to hear him out. Tell me. From under his cap, Fang holds forth. He describes first brother, who used his freakish sea-sucking ability to find valuable exotic fish. Every day he plundered the ocean, bringing in a living for the family. And then one day, a child asked to go with him, begged to be allowed to search the waterless seabed. The first brother agreed to let him come if he made one crucial promise that he would return to the shore when it was time. The child promised. When they reached the shore, first brother deployed his powers. He swallowed the ocean. He literally drank the sea, Fang says. His head grew and grew, swelling tightly like an enormous balloon on which his slanted eyes were distorted to tiny slits. With greed and delight, the child rushed out to play and search upon the rocky bed. While the child ignored his signals to return, the first brother stood on the shore, suffering, his face turning red, his cheeks bulging with the world of coursing salt water, his head 1,000 times its normal size. He was a strong guy, Fang says, but even he could not hold out. It is very hard to hold in the sea. Eventually, he had to give in. The sea gushed back out of his mouth, and the little boy drowned under the waves, dead. Can't we talk about this later, Fang? The rest of the book is about the consequences of this unfortunate death, Fang persists, and who tries to do the cover-up? The other brothers. Their gifts, talents, their freakish abilities have existed throughout time for the sole purpose in this narrative of avoiding the consequences of the murder. James and Fang face each other. I know what you're thinking. James's voice rings through the alleyway. You think Dago was holding it in. He's first brother. He couldn't take it anymore. He let his suffering and anger spew forth and he killed our father. But I don't believe it. I think the whole thing was an accident and Dago's innocent. His shouts startle the pigeons roosting above who flutter up and vanish from view. Fang doesn't answer. The pigeons circle back. What is it? James asks more quietly. What do you want? I've got to ask you this, Fang says. I know you testified to the police. I've read the newspapers and the news sites. I know about what you told them, but I've been considering every detail, considering with, let's say, a view from outside the family, an objective view. I want to understand what happened, independent of what Officer Buchek says is true, or what the jury decides is true. Maybe the difference between us is that I believe in the process, Jane says, folding his arms. The police and the jury will figure out what happened. My question is this, Fang says, ignoring him. When you went downstairs a second time, close to the end of the party, to get more ice, did you really see the key on the shelf at that time? Yes, I did. You're going to testify in court. I don't think I can get out of it. Because, Fang says, if you're wrong, if you remembered wrong and the key was not on the shelf at the end of the party, then your father could have been killed by anybody, and not just Dago, by anyone during the party, or even anyone who happened to be inside the restaurant to sneak it off the shelf in the weeks before the party. No, James says, the pigeons above are no longer circling but clucking, cooing, and listening. Here's where we disagree. I do remember seeing the key on the shelf, but even if I remembered it wrong, I believe someone could have stumbled down there and accidentally removed the key. It was an accident. James, Fang says, you loved your dad, but don't let your love make you so blind that you can't see you were the only person who did. Everybody hated him. No one hated him enough to kill him. How can you say what depths of hatred people keep to themselves? The Scares, for example. Do we know what the Scares feel about your family's restaurant? What they think your parents' workaholism has done to drain their family businesses over the years? And there are others. James doesn't answer. He remembers Dago's story about Ken Fan shamed by Leo's behavior at the post office. My father made them all look bad. Fang is still talking. Did your dad claim that he was going to sell the restaurant to make Dago angry enough to do it? Is Ming mercenary and bitter enough to do it? Or what if Dago wasn't alone in this? How about Brenda? Why is she so involved with your brother? If all she wants is money, she would start sleeping with an older man. Either she, one, got yellow fever, or two, she's hot for your brother specifically. What if she's unwilling to give up having sex with your brother? What future does he have except his father's restaurant? James says, you've got sex on the brain. It takes one to know one, Fang says, raising his brows, but thanks for giving me credit. Because I can't attract sexual partners, people think it doesn't matter to me. He warns off James's objection with an upraised hand. Anyway, I'm not sure what it is exactly, but something was going on. Well, you're wrong about Brenda, James says. She would never get Dago into so much trouble. But why wouldn't it be an employee, Fang says. I know JJ was in California, but what about that woman who chops vegetables? Oh, Lan, she never goes near the freezer. She couldn't read the sign, so she didn't know about the key. Then back to Brenda. How did she get hired? Your father usually hires FOBs. My dad's hired outside servers before. Brenda's broke, and so my dad gave her a job. As a favor, James adds, although he knows Fang won't believe him. You know as well as I do, your father didn't give favors. It was all a transaction for him. He never made a simple transaction. He made a deal. Listen, I know my mother is much tougher than she appears, but even she had to pull off some stunts in order to do the grocery business with your dad. He would have run her out of business if he hadn't figured out it would be too time-consuming and potentially risky to buy his Oriental groceries on his own. Oh no, he let my mother stay afloat as a calculated cost. He didn't think about anyone except himself. You know it's true. It could be true, James acknowledges. An apparent transaction, James. Just admit that he screwed everyone. Women for sex, men for money. Anyone might have had the motive to kill Leo, might have had an itch they needed to satisfy, might still need. They've reached the end of an alleyway. They're walking out into a sidewalk that runs along a broad avenue. 2 blocks away, in an older residential neighborhood, is the former school where the spiritual house is located. James lowers his voice because they're no longer shielded. What do you mean, still? Fang peers at James from under his cap. Well, where's your father's money? There's not a peep in the news that anyone has found any of his money. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. All right, do you want me to answer questions? Oh, cool. Okay, I like answering questions.
We do have a wireless mic. Where's the footing on this? Right. So you're welcome if you want the mic, raise your hand for it, or stand up and speak very loudly.
Does anyone have questions?
Oh, they have questions.
Okay. Thank you.
So as I understand, this novel took a while, right? Work, life, interruptions. In the last, can you tell us a little bit about the journey? Because I think how long things take and how complicated it can become is really interesting.
Sure. I mean, I think that my teaching, people often think that if you're a teacher, it wrecks your writing life. Because they think you put all of your energy into other people's work and you get nothing back. But that hasn't been my experience. This started when I was advising a student who was an undergrad, who was a Russian literature major, and he was taking creative writing classes because he loved literature. And he loved the Brothers Karamazov. This was back in 2005. And I was not at the University of Iowa at the time. And So I read The Brothers Karamazov. I was 40 years old and had never read it. And I was just blown away by it. I was blown away by the scope of it. It's just a huge novel, and it asks these huge questions. There are a lot of characters, and each of them has 1 million nicknames. And it's just this world that you throw yourself into and just sort of trust that at some point you'll come out of it, may be altered. And I just loved that. I mean, I love novels, period. But so I read it, and, you know, I pretty much just let it go. At the time, I was in between projects, which is a really bad place for me. I hate being in between projects. I think I was talking about this at lunch with some students yesterday. Hope it wasn't discouraging. I just don't get ideas very fast. I'm very slow. And I was doing things like writing a bunch of pages that I knew would never make it into any book. I wrote 100 pages about a family in the Midwest that had 3 children and a very tyrannical but charismatic father figure, and sort of a troubled marriage between the father and the mother. And the thing that was interesting about it for me and kept me working on it for 100 pages was that I wrote it in the present tense. And the present tense is something that I always told my students never to do. Like, don't write in the present tense, I would say to them. Because to me, at the time, I thought the present tense does not exist, right? Like, things are not actually unfolding as you're turning the pages and reading your book. So why are you, writing this way? I thought to myself. But then I discovered that it was a huge pleasure to write in the present tense. Okay, so that was one humbling moment. The thing is I think what I liked so much about the present tense is that it feels to me very oral. So if somebody asked you, so what happened today at the store, you would say, so I'm going to the store and I walk into the door and this man wearing a, clown suit appears and says, want to take a picture with me or whatever. But you're in the present tense as you're relating this story. And so there was that about it, and there was also this sense of unfolding. Other people have described it as immediacy, but I I find that word annoying, so it was one of the reasons I didn't think my students would benefit from writing in the present tense, because immediacy felt to me like television, right? It just sort of unfolds in front of you, or it feels like it's right in your face. But what I liked about it was this sense of something sort of being, something further out of reach being withheld from you as you are moving sort of through something that you don't know toward whatever is going to happen next, to this unknown thing. Okay, so, and then I got my job at Iowa, and then I put everything aside and like stopped working on it, period. And through, you know, put the 100 pages into another file. And and then I think I moved to Iowa City. I started working as director of the program. I had a child, and then I wrote another totally unrelated novel about some poets. Yeah, really different. And actually, the last time I came to visit, it was my most recent work. So you would have written an introduction about, like, that included stuff about that book about poets. Okay, very serious book about poets, very few jokes, like very, very low key. So then I didn't write for maybe 3 or 4 years. I was just so overwhelmed with my job. People were coming in and out. If you work in an academic setting, somebody is always on the verge of retiring, or like someone's always leaving or coming. You always need to fill in some way for various things. And so I didn't get work done for a long time. Also, being a parent, it was one thing to be a parent to a child who was too young to talk. And I was able to write my first book when she was too young to speak, but then when she got old enough to hold up her end of the conversation, that took a lot of getting used to. It was like another person in the house with like thoughts. So that was really, you know, because I had always been on my own until I got married quite late. So just getting used to all these people around was a problem. And then one day, I was advising another student, and he gave me this novel excerpt to read that had a very sort of sinuous, unreliable first-person narration, and then he said to me, I always base my projects on existing works. I am really obsessed with this novel by Ford Madox Ford, The Good Soldier. For anyone who's read it, it's just stunningly good. And fascinating narrator, fascinating narration, and like the narrative is like really complicated. It's just so interesting. If you're into that kind of thing, I highly recommend. Anyway, I thought to myself, like, this is interesting. Maybe you should try to write a narrative that's based on something. I should say that at this point I loved the Brothers Karamazov so much that I was like gently forcing people to read it with me, which is one of the advantages of being a teacher. So I would hold these like non-credit classes where I would like make people sign up and promise to read the Brothers Karamazov over Thanksgiving break so that I would have someone to talk about it with. And we would meet like for a total of up to 6 hours to talk about this book, which I think, you know, it ended up being worthwhile, I think, not just for me, but for them, I like to tell myself. Because years later, right, when I published this book, like some of them have jobs, like one of them is like doing interviews of people, authors for a podcast, and like we were on Zoom doing this podcast taping, and he pulls out this old copy of the edition of the Brothers Karamazov that we all read. And I could see that it was the same one, you know, like he was still really into it, and he was not the only student who did that. So I was pretty thrilled, ultimately. Anyway, at the time, I thought, wow, you know what? I've taught this book so many times that it's imprinted on my mind, like it's part of me. It's like part of my consciousness. What would happen if, and I had this present tense thing from years ago, like at that point it was probably 8 or 9 years ago, I had written this present tense thing about the tyrannical father, and I thought, what if this is the tyrannical father? And what if I write like an homage? Now this is interesting to me because at some point I came to visit Davidson and talk to you about your fan fiction class, and I was thinking to myself, what is the difference between fan fiction and an homage? And as far as I can tell, not that much. That's why we were talking about fan fiction today at lunch, and I kept trying to pump the students for more info about fan fiction. So I thought, I'm going to write an homage to the Brothers Karamazov. I'm going to make it, you know, Chinese American, and in the Midwest where I grew up. And I grew up with three sisters. There were four of us sisters in a small Midwestern city in Wisconsin. And I thought, I can't write about sisters because it's not enough of a stretch of the imagination. I need to write about the brothers, and I'll just do that. So it took me, after I figured that out, it took about 6 years. So yeah, I highly believe in patience for writers. I think it's really hard when you're just starting out to not know what's going to happen like next year, but try to think about things in a sort of long term and just stick with your writing, and I totally believe that it works out. That is my weird story about how this book got written.
Thank you. That's
You're
amazing.
welcome. Oh, goody, there's another question.
So it strikes me as interesting that you said your previous novel was so serious, because you use a lot of humor. And I was wondering if you, about quite painful situations. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about humor.
Sure. I'm interested in the comic novel. I'm interested in the idea that if you are from the margins, if you are in a place where you're slightly on the outside watching, that is the distance that's necessary for comedy. Alan Gurganis, who's this great North Carolinian writer, I don't know if anyone's read anything of Alan's. He's just shockingly good writer and lives in North Carolina, your home state, or your current state. So you should check him out. But I actually sat in on a class of his. See, this is again where going to school is good. And he talked about comedy and how you have to have a distance. There's like a certain amount of distance that's required. If it's up really close, it feels more tragic. But it's the same material a lot of the time. This sense of growing up outside as an outsider, which my family experienced acutely as we were the first non-white family in Appleton, Wisconsin, according to my big sister. I was too small to know. I was a baby. By the time I was like maybe 7 or 8, there were 2 other families, but there were no other girls. Like, we were the only girls in Appleton who were Asian girls. And my dad was sort of terrified that we would go astray in some way. And he was really controlling. And some of my sisters, like my oldest sister fought tooth and nail with him, like in a very open way. But my next sister would crawl out the window. My parents had these rules like, you can go to the movies with the boy, but you can't go at night. And we're like, well, no, we're like, hello, it's dark in the movies regardless of what time of day you go. But they were just very, very strict about what they thought we should be doing. So wait, now I've gotten distracted. But the idea of sort of being an outsider, having that distance on the society that you live in was actually very helpful for me. I will say that I've written 3 other books and none of them contain like any jokes whatsoever. And well, no, there's maybe like 1 or 2 jokes in the most recent book. But like, I think what happened to me was a lot of things. One was that I grew up, I was telling someone at lunch, in this writing culture where everyone wanted to be Raymond Carver or maybe Alice Munro, and that was it. Like, there were no other writers that people could profess to actually wanting to be. And that whole rule of writing like Raymond Carver, you know, the Gordon Lish version of Raymond Carver, is to use as few words as possible. And this is actually what Strunk and White also say. Omit needless words. So we all wrote this really, really sort of like battened down stuff when I was in graduate school. And that's what we were rewarded for by our peers. Like, I had some teachers who were more open. My professor, James Allen McPherson, he was very open to different kinds of writing, but most of us were just desperately policing each other at the time. And so I wrote Hunger, which I think some people have read in class, which, you know, I'm very proud of that book, and it's very, very, like, it's quiet, and it's you know, intense, quiet suffering, immigrant suffering, which I did, you know, I could relate to and did experience, but, there was one story in that collection called The Eve of the Spirit Festival, in which when I was writing it, I felt like my skills or what I had been taught was inadequate to describe what was in the story, and it was in the fights between the father and the older sister. I mean, I had experienced, these really knockdown, drag-out fights. I did not have a way to describe them in the writing style that I'd been taught, which made me start to wonder, like, we did not actually live lives of quiet desperation when I was growing up. We lived lives of noisy desperation. I mean, we were always, I don't know, yelling. Something was always going on that would make somebody be yelling. And even my mom, who claimed not to be as bad-tempered as my father, she would have her moments, where it was really clear that she had a terrible temper. And so there was also a lot of laughter in my family. We were always, there was always something funny happening, and everyone was very verbal. And even my dad could make jokes in Chinese and English, which I think is shocking, considering that he didn't come to the country until he was in his 30s. I mean, I know, he was a very funny guy. So I just thought, I want to write in a style that encompasses a wider emotional range. And so this is really the first time I've ever done it. And I think what freed me up to do that was reading Dostoevsky, who, I mean, I'm rereading The Brothers Karamazov now because I put it aside for 6 years because I knew I couldn't. So I'm rereading it, and I'm thinking, wow, these characters are really over the top. I mean, I thought my characters were over the top, but these are like, kneeling on the floor in front of other characters, like begging and pleading and crying about small things. And, I was sort of impressed with it all over again. It's a broad emotional range I was going for, including the humor, and also this sense of comedy as arising from a skewed angle on a society. That's what comedy does. Okay, any other questions? How about a student? Oh, yay.
In your first question, or in the response to our first question, you said you talked about the stretch of imagination, and in this last question, you kind of were talking about a stretch of genre. And I'm just wondering, what does that challenge do for you as a writer, and what does that stretch do for you?
It makes me feel more adult. Like, I was a very cautious person as a child, not necessarily in the things I did or thought, but in the way I behaved. I was like very introverted, and in a sort of timid way, rule-abiding, even though I don't think I'm a really rule-abiding person, frankly, like in the reality of it. But like, I was just really just trying to understand how things worked so that I didn't do something really stupid. And that was basically my MO for my entire, I don't know, until I was well into my 40s, I think. So I think it has something to do with just feeling more being able to sort of try something beyond what you've done before, that I slowly began to understand was a part of who I was. I always saw myself as this timid person, and then ultimately I realized that no, actually, I like doing and discovering and pursuing and trying to do things in my own way. Like, I'm never gonna be a skydiver, but every book I've written has been substantially different from the book before it. And I realized that something is happening to me in between those books. Like, I'm learning something about, I don't know, the form, or about time as I get older especially, or about humans, and I'm trying to put it into my book in a different way. And I think I've decided that maybe that's just a part of who I am. It's sort of like buying a house. I don't know if this analogy is going to work exactly, especially in today's newly inflationary economy, but maybe it does. I think it does work better in an inflationary economy. You take the amount of money you have, and then you take out a massive loan on the house. I'm not saying everyone has to do this. Some people can pay in cash, but even people who can afford to pay in cash usually pay part of it and then take out the loan, because of the interest rate. Like you're just taking a risk. You're just stretching what you have. You stretch, and then hopefully nothing horrible happens, and then you end up with a house. I don't know if that describes what it's like, but it's like that with everything. At least for me, in my adult life, everything that's been of interest and of value has required me stretching out of my comfort zone. Like, this is why I'm mildly confused when people now say this is uncomfortable, and uncomfortable is bad. Because, like, in my experience, making myself do uncomfortable things has been the biggest growing experience that I could possibly have.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for asking a question. Does anyone else have a question? Only one more question. Oh, here's one. Yay. Oh, cool. Okay, we'll do two.
I think, like, as Asian Americans right now, when we talk about death, unfortunately, it's marred with, like, the memories of the Atlanta spa shooting, and your novel is very focused on death. How has that experience and what has happened reflected in your writing and the way you talk about your novel?
Okay, so when I was in high school, Vincent Chin was murdered. So I have a sort of like long sort of backstory on this. Like, I remember the shooting of Vincent Chin, and he was a Chinese guy who happened to be living in the Detroit area during a time when Japanese automakers were ascendant, and people in Detroit were very angry, and he was killed. And the people who killed him said they thought he was Japanese. And I remember that super clearly. I don't want to give away the plot of my novel. It's not about death, but there is a lot of sort of experience in the novel about what it's like to grow up in a society where essentially, no matter how long you've been in this society, you will always be seen as an outsider. I feel at this point what's being projected onto Asian faces and Asian people, I mean, it's hard to say when it will change or whether it will change, but I think it's been around for a really long time. That's my take on it. And one of the reasons I wrote about this, one reason I wrote the book as loudly as I did, is that I feel that it's important for us to, as Asian writers, to feel like we can make our characters experience a wide range of things. So these characters are not good people. They're not well-behaved, quiet people. They're people who make huge mistakes. They express themselves loudly. And they're not necessarily all good. They're not model minorities. They sort of, the three brothers all do really passionate and not great things in the book. And by the end of the book, they ask themselves, are we still immigrants because our parents are gone now and we're here now? But really, and I didn't write about this directly, but the answer is that yes, in some ways they will never stop being immigrants because they still look like they're from outside. So yeah, it's a really interesting question and one that I've been thinking about a lot. Thanks.
And he's going to get the last question. There you go, my dear.
Hi, I loved hearing you talk about like your process for coming up with the novel, and I was wondering if in general you have like a daily like writing routine or like like you have a process for when you want to write but you don't have an idea.
Oh man, okay, that's a really good question. How do I write when I don't have an idea? I'm terrible at that.
Same.
I'm really terrible at, I was saying that I'm really bad in between projects, and my real problem is coming out with a new project. So what has worked okay, and then the other thing is that every time I start a new project, I think, this has never been so bad. It will never work out again. I might as well just give up and stop writing forever. And then I usually try a bunch of really horrible, sort of piddly kind of like stabs or gestures at things that sort of don't work out. In fact, after I finished writing this book, I had this big plan that I was going to just rap out another book instantly. And I had this idea, and I was like, I'm just going to go with this idea. And I wrote 200 pages. I finished the arc, and then I just realized that it's not my next book. Okay, fine. But I don't think that that was a mistake. I don't think it was wrong to spend an entire year writing 200 pages that will never see the light of day. For one thing, it rules out that idea, so I can cross it off the list of potential ideas. And I mean, but that actually means something to me. But for another thing, I feel like it just helped me pass the time before I could come up with another idea that's going to work. And I have no idea what it'll be. I have some thoughts. Generally, I think what's been working for me when I look back through my journals, so one thing I do is I keep a writing log of, like, even when I think about writing, I write in my log. So that counts. Writing in my log counts as writing for me. And then what I've done recently, well, before my book came out, when I still had time, was to go back and look in my log at how I came up with the ideas for this book. And it's really fascinating because, like, maybe 20 years ago, I wrote in my journal, the story takes place in one evening. It is a huge dinner party. And I thought, oh, wow. Like, when I look back, I realized that I'd completely forgotten I'd ever written that note. And that the centerpiece of this book is a scene with a massive dinner party. It's the scene where, like, various things happen and, like, they realize that the family dog has been missing. You know, like, it's the scene that happens right before everything sort of falls apart. So I see that the elements of the book have been percolating in my mind for so many years that I can't even keep track of them. So why bother to figure out what's what? Like, eventually, if I go back and think about the ideas that I used to have, something slowly begins to emerge. And I don't think I'm the only writer who has this problem. One of the most successful writers I know, I would name her, everyone's heard of this person. They're older than me. Every time she finishes a book, she thinks she's never going to write another book. And it's just wild to me. And her most recent book came out like 2 years ago, and it's been a wildly successful book. And when I talked to her recently, she made it seem like she was never going to write a book again. She was going through this horrible, horrible period of fallowness, during which usually what she would do was use the money from her very successful previous book to buy a new house, renovate it from top to bottom, learn to play the piano, like travel to Africa and like do a huge research project, or not even a research, but like a project, and then say, I'm never writing again, then would sit down and write the next bestseller. I don't know. I think everyone has a horrible time coming up with new ideas. Although, can I say there are some people who seem to have no problem with this at all? So maybe things aren't given out equally. Anyway, thanks. It's been a real pleasure to read to you and to be here.
Thank you. I wanted to remind you, books are available for sale in the lobby. We have graduation, Easter, Mother's Day, graduation, Father's Day, birthdays, Christmas, all of which books are a very good present, and they're right out there. So.